Oh, yes, sorry, just to unblank those. There we go.
Great. So the second speaker is Konstantinos Giannos. He's from Greece and he just finished a bachelor in music studies and now he aims to study a master's in cognitive musicology in Amsterdam. So big clap.
Hello everyone. The title of my paper is Chord Encoding and Root-finding, and I'm going to talk about I'll do a short historic overview of how chords are formed, and then ask some questions about how we perceive them computationally and cognitively. You can see that. Anyways, that's fine. Thanks.
There are mics there, I think we'll be okay.
Firstly, a chord was a form term by Starlino in the early 16th century, setting down the term of a triad, and being followed by Rameau some centuries later. He figures a technique to form chords as a stack of thirds, and with a basic root as a tone of reference, that is the son fondamental. However, his system implies some ambiguity. For example, a fourth chord with an added sixth has the same notes as a second chord with an added seventh. Such ambiguities have been tackled by Riemann's functional harmony, where he mentions three main chord functions: tonic, dominant and subdominant, and all the rest chords rely on those. As music got more complex in the 20th century, Hindemith was one of those that tried to improve the existing theory. He invented a series where he ordered intervals from a perfect fifth to a minor second and major seventh, and applied a root on these intervals, hence designing a root-finding algorithm, and after that placing those chords in groups. Furthermore, I'm going to talk about categorical perception. It is important to take into consideration that property of listeners which understand musical entities, different musical entities in contexts. Such can be pitches, intervals, chords, durational relationships, rhythmic patterns, or even phrases in phrase groups. However, the level of significance isn't yet clear. Some two basic properties that we can define is the octave equivalence, or pitch, as you can know from pitch class, and the interval equivalence, where an interval of perfect fifth is equivalent to a perfect fourth, etc. So to encode a chord, we need some tone of reference, especially in tonal contexts, and the order of intervals. For example, Forte's prime form abstraction doesn't keep those two, which means it's rather abstract, and it can be used, for example, in tonal music. Furthermore, I'm going to speak about a new system, a new model, general chord type, that is representing chords based on a given hierarchy. That means a different scale, either it is a major or minor, or a more extreme scale like pentatonics, octatonics, which can be represented with that vector. 0 is the pitch class that starts the scale, and this is the formation, like 0, 2 semitones above, 4 semitones, 5, etc. That's the same as E flat, starts from 3 and goes on. A second parameter that's taken into account is a 12-value binary consonance-dissonance vector, where 0 means dissonance and 1 means consonance. For example, in tonal paradigms, this vector has been used. Another vector we use in representations could be an all 1 vector, where all the values are 1, considering all the intervals consonant, for example in Neo-Tonal music. To further explain that system, we give as an input some MIDI numbers which do the modulo 12 operation, and we take this as a result and then order them from lower to higher. Then, given a key, we find the maximal subset of consonant notes, and we see that 269 is the largest one, and we add the left note on the right. Comparing that to a scale, we can see that second degree is the base of the chord, hence a major 7th chord on the second degree, or a D major chord. Here is an example, first example of this representation. You can see on the table on the first column the pitch classes of each chord in the reduction, then their prime forms, their abstract representation without taking into account order and tone of reference, and then the GCTs with the tonal vector we mentioned before, and the last column is where the vector is all 1. As for the left part of the slide, we can see 3 systems: GCT, Parkert, and Hindemith. GCT is the one I explained to you. Parkert refers to perceptual pitch finding model, where he gives ratings to some specific intervals, like a perfect fifth, a major third, etc. And by also applying a voicing as a note in the bass, and the profiles of Krumhamsel and Kensler, he's trying to apply that in tonal music. Where Hindemith also has an interval hierarchy, starting as I told you. Furthermore, we are going to see just one example of non-tonal music. Here we have an expert of Paul Hindemith, where here there are the GCT representations which take into account the issue of superimposed fourths, whereas GCTs abstract the intervals in their closest form, a fact that Hindemith wants to distinguish. A chord with fourths is completely different with a chord of a second and a fifth. Here we can see that the last column and the second column are very close to each other. The number on the left side behind the comma can be similar to the transformation operator in pitch class theory. So to conclude, I'm going to refer to ambiguity one more time. It is a hard issue to resolve. There are many factors that need to be taken into account. However, when we need to encode a chord, we have to have a tone of reference that gives us the picture of the chord. For example, we have GCT, which maintains the order of interval just as Hindemith wants on his system and music, or finding similarities with the perceptual root model of Parkert. For example, where other idioms are used, musical idioms are used, interesting approach is to use interval vectors, where we can see which intervals are important in that specific chord or context, and improve the consonance dissonance vector. Closing, I have to give a parallel between GCTs and the prime forms of forte. We can see that GCT all one, like here, are very closely similar, I might say identical to the prime forms, but mostly as a transformation or an inversion of the set. But it's necessary to mention that prime forms are not universal and cannot be used in tonal contexts. However, GCT is able to be more flexible and applied in Neo-Tonal music, maybe atonal, as we saw they're very similar, and also tonal, as we saw the example of Beethoven. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, and I think we have about 5-6 minutes for questions. Yona.
Thank you very much for your interesting talk. It's really cool to see the GCT algorithm applied to these more complex tonal structures. I was wondering, though, what you felt about the cognitive implications of this. It's obviously assumed by many people that in normal, classical, common practice tonal music, we hear roots of chords, and therefore it makes sense to have an algorithm that automatically extracts those roots, and that kind of replicates what we hear. Personally, how much do you think this applies for this more complex sort of neo-tonal music, for example? Do we actually, as listeners, hear roots of these chords?
Sometimes it's harder to find a root while we listen a chord. However, since if we take into account the fact that Hindemith chose to have roots as a formation of chords, however, in atonal music, this concept is non-existent, is irrelevant, and could lead to fallacies. However, since the music suggests such an idea, it's important to use them in encoding, but it's not always perceptually there.
Okay, so you're using it basically to extract what the composer was putting in.
Yeah, that's the attempt.
Cool, that makes sense. Thank you.
We still have time for
One
more question.
Or two? Maybe three!
Yeah. Come on, guys.
Well, if anyone wants to ask any more questions, we can do it online as well afterwards,
Yeah.
and I'm sure there'll be more discussions.
Okay.
So, should we move on? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.